Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 21. In today's episode, we're chatting with author John Mahoney, who has written several books on wine, but we'll be focusing on his latest, Is Wine the Source of Civilization? Spoiler alert, yes, the answer is yes. But the more interesting question is why? John has some fascinating answers, plus some of the best practical tips on enjoying wine that I've ever heard. One has to do with temperature, so keep listening for that one toward the end of our chat. Enjoy. All right, folks, now I usually start with some questions to intrigue you, but I have to read these quotes about the books that our guest has written, just to let you know the interesting debate and discussion we're going to have tonight. Nothing evokes spirituality, history, and dining together better than wine, and no one tells the tale of this substance better than John Mahoney. From the tablets of Gilgamesh to the tables of modern China, Mahoney weaves together a historical context with sensory engagement. He not only provides the nuances to thoughtful understanding, he clearly demonstrates wine's connection to the fundamentals of social life. It is an essential read. Our guest, so impressive. He's a former university professor of literature with a PhD in linguistical philology. He is a respected scholar of Shakespeare and Chaucer. He's also a certified wine educator and has taught wine classes at the University of Pennsylvania, the University of Delaware, Drexel University, and Rutgers University. He's also the author of 8 books, including his most recent, just launched this month, Wine, the Source of Civilization. And he joins me from his home just south of Atlantic City in New Jersey. Welcome, John Mahoney. Hello.
Natalie, welcome. I'm very happy to be here with you.
Oh, this is terrific. I am so looking forward to our chat here, John.
Nice to hear that your weather's been so fine, because South Jersey at this time of the year is filled with all our Canadian friends. And I just heard a couple of them talking the other night about how nice it was back home, but it's been over 35 here with high humidity. It's been atrocious.
Yes. It's definitely rosé weather. What have you got in your glass, John?
Mine's a Côte d'Aron, right?
All right. So your book is Wine, the Source of Civilization.
Right.
What got you started on that track? You've written 8 books, but what triggered the idea for you for this book?
Well, a book that's currently out is called Wine for Intellectuals, which is a fun book because you're not supposed to be a genius. People have been intimidated to pick it up, Natalie, but you're supposed to say, I just got into wine and I want to learn all I can as quickly as I can. So it's written like a conversation over a dinner table. And the idea is you can start with no knowledge about wine, but slowly move into the top 20 or even 15% of knowledgeable wine people throughout the world. And at the end of each chapter, it kind of summarizes with little notes saying what you should really know to enhance your life. That's all it comes about, not to be pretentious. A good book of mine, I want to even actually plug it right now. A friend of mine, Ed McCarthy, wrote Wine for Dummies. But if you're sitting on the Jersey beaches or the shore during the summer or riding in the subway or on a bus, you feel more comfortable holding a book that says Wine for Intellectuals than Wine for Dummies. So I've heard that from so many people that said, I like both books, John, but I like to be seen holding yours.
Maybe they put his inside of yours.
Sometimes they've done that, and they've read them both, and they've looked for cross-references.
That's great.
And people that read this, that's how it actually came about. Some former students, young people. I was so pleased that young people were getting into wine away from just the traditional shot and beer mentality that we think about during the college age. And began to ask me questions about, well, where did this come from? Who was the first person that made wine? So it was students' questions that made me begin researching it. And as I started to research it, I found out that I was taught that civilization had established itself from, say, Babylon or Egypt. We go back to the time of Christ, that's 2,000 years. Everything else is BC. And everybody thought that wine was 3,000. Then they said, well, no, it's probably 4, even 5,000 years old. But two places established that that was incorrect: the University of Toronto and the University of Pennsylvania, in this, one of the Ivy League schools in the States. Both of them did research and found out that it's well over 3, 4, 5,000 years old. They've proven and actually have done scientific testing to prove that wine production is probably 7.5 to 8,000 years old.
Wow.
My research took it further, and I'm saying that we started with wine right after the last ice age.
Wow. How did you make the connection?
Well, all of us start out being ignorant. That's the first thing you have to face up to. And if you never face up to that, you never learn anything. My dad, God bless him, was born in Ireland. I'm first generation American. I always hate to say American because we're all Americans, North Americans, aren't we?
Yes.
Right? Just like before when you did Celsius, there's only 3 countries left that are still on the Fahrenheit aspect. And when I'm traveling somewhere, I really wish this country would switch over to it. We tried it back during Jimmy Carter's era, but there was a lot of reluctance to it. So I use a little poem whenever I'm traveling with friends and teaching them about wine and stuff. And I always tell them, I don't understand the numbers. Was it 90 today or something? They said it was 15 or it's going to be 30. And I said, simple: 30 is hot, 20 is nice, 10 is cold, 0 is ice.
Oh,
And
that's good.
yeah, and you can fit them right in, and I actually did it when I was down in South Africa last year. And so when I'm traveling, I do that. And what I found was, having been ignorant about a lot of things opens your mind. You tend to listen a little more. My son and I were in Africa. We did a lot of stuff in Egypt, and then we went to Kenya and Tanzania. And I stumbled onto something really fascinating. Neither are big wine producing countries, but they do produce wine in both Kenya and Tanzania that we never get the opportunity to taste. And they really weren't bad, but we were right on the equator in Kenya. And I was talking to one of the young Maasai, and he's talking about how the vines had helped him as he was growing up learn about directions. And I said, I'm completely lost at this. I've never heard this before. He said, like the Coriolis effect about water in Canada and the States. If you flush a toilet or pull a plug from a sink, how it runs clockwise. But if you're in Australia or South Africa, the water runs counterclockwise. I said, I'm very familiar with that. And he says, and it has to do with the fluids. And I said, yes, but how does that make you find your way home? He said, we would go out and find the wild grapevines. And if they're curving in one direction, we know we're north of the equator. And if they're curving in the opposite direction, ever since I came back, I was doing some research in Chile and Argentina last year, and I watched the way the tentacles and the vines grew around the wires. And I mentioned this to the viticulturist, and he said, I never paid attention to that. And one of them actually worked in Sonoma County at the same time. He would do one season in North America and one season in South America. I said, yeah, it's because everything that has to do with the fluids, the direction it'll curl in. I found that really fascinating. And then that began to open up all kinds of things. And then you find the legends.
Right. What was your next step in writing this book? You figured out the association or the close proximity to the Ice Age. And
yeah, a lot of my friends were all taught the same thing I was, that wine became a product of the civilization. We know the stories of the monks in the Middle Ages. We know the Romans. If you actually got into viticulture and you started doing research, it's always curious about where did it start. The first things I found were legends and tales, and that came through teaching. When you're teaching Beowulf, that's Old English, actually. Chaucer's Middle English. So when you go back to Beowulf, and then you find out, well, that's nowhere near as old as Gilgamesh back in the Babylonian legends, which came from the Canaanites and the Hittites. And they all had stories about wine. But the Persians had stories about how it was always accidentally found. They talk about a legend of Jemsed, who was a maiden who was so distraught with her life that she said the grapes were fermenting there and she thought they were poison. That's one of the original legends. And she just drank it to end her life and slept like a baby. And she woke up refreshed the next morning, and all the rest of the court had found out about it. And they found out that the natural yeast on the grapes will ferment wine, no matter how mediocre it is, but it will turn grape juice into alcoholic wine.
right.
I assumed then that, gee, our ancestors must have found it even earlier. So I started talking to many of my professor friends about the economy, and they said, no. Civilizations developed, and there were wars, and the Bronze Age came along after the Stone Age, and then wine was there. And I said to them, no, I think it was just the other way around. We were happy being hunter-gatherers, especially from the man's point of view, a male point of view. We went fishing and hunting every day. The women took care of the children, cleaned the cave, lit the fires, did all that kind of stuff. And then we stumbled on, probably in a crevice in a rock somewhere where grapes had fallen, naturally fermented, and out of thirst or just out of curiosity, they tried it. And my assumption is that had to happen right after the last ice age because vines were prolific all over North America. We know, talk about Leif Erikson being the first one to get here and calling the area Vinland. That was almost 500 years before Columbus. So the early hunter-gatherers became so fascinated with this, and they learned very quickly that when the grapes were harvested and then crushed, well, they didn't know about yeast, but they knew that it would naturally metamorphose into this liquid that had more of a kick, and it would give them spiritual inclinations. And they all relaxed more. And that's probably at the same time that music was being evolved. I just did some research on these mammoth flutes they found in German caves that were 35,000 years old, which means music had to initiate very, very early too. Well, couple that together with wine, and you start getting people to say, I'm tired of roaming and following the bison. If we stay right here, we can plant grapevines.
Huh, wow.
Well, as soon as that happened, they now had something to trade. So the Neanderthals were beginning to fade out. Cro-Magnons were taking over. And remember, the Neanderthals were tool users, but they did not modify stones. All the research seemed to show that they used tools, unlike most of the other animals, but they'd never changed them. Only our Cro-Magnon ancestors modified or split the stone or split the flint and made a sharper knife and did things with it. And now they had to go get other things leading into the Bronze Age. So they had a commodity. Whichever little tribe, whichever little community had fermented wine had something to trade to get the things they needed. And so commerce began to become very, very rapid because they had a commodity that people wanted.
Yeah, absolutely. As you were researching this book, that triggered the idea and it all makes sense as a thesis. So how did you expand on that? Where did you go next with it?
I put it together chronologically. Everything I found traced back to the Black Sea and the Caucasus Mountains. During Marco Polo's time, they always had the silk trade and the silk route down through Western Turkey, all the way down through the Middle East, heading towards India and China. Started finding pieces of literature. And most literature is based on something that actually happened. Christians and Jews that have read the Old Testament about Noah, and Noah landed his ark on a mountaintop, which today is north central Turkey. And it says in there, and the first thing he did when he landed was plant a vineyard. And I thought, gee, that's fascinating because why wouldn't they mention anything else about building a house or doing something else? Why did they pick that? And over the years, I have found that almost all literature, all these tales are all based on something that actually happened. So there probably was an enormous flood because as you get into literature, you find not only did the ancient Jews have the tales of flood, but they picked that story up when they were captives in Babylonia. The Babylonians had that tale at least 1,000 years before Judaism moved back towards Palestine area. And they began to tie it together. That's where they also brought back the book of Job and tales and different ideas. Like so much of our Western modern New Testament is basically fundamental to the Greek Dionysian tales. The mother-son, the idea, the rejuvenation idea. So I actually do a whole chapter on wine and theology, not to make anybody devoid of any theology, but just saying the stories that they use to help you understand in theology go way, way back. Then I began to visit these areas. When I visited Bulgaria and Romania about 6 years ago, I talked about wine and what they were doing. And surprisingly, everybody on the western shores of Bulgaria said, no, they were well aware of the fact that their ancestors had brought it from the eastern shore. So I had to go to the Republic of Georgia. In that whole area, and then doing more research, Armenia and eastern Georgia was called Anatolia. And you find this in the ancient Canaanite writings and the Hittite writings, even Phoenicians who came before the Greeks referred to that as the ancient times, right? But they all made references to carrying wine. So the Phoenicians were the first ones to carry the grapevines all the way around. So I'm saying to myself, 5,000 years ago, 3,000 BC, wine was a major commodity. And luckily, they carried it in this clay amphora.
That's what Georgia is famous for. And it's kind of the resurgence now of these orange wines and natural wines.
In the actual clay, yeah. And they call them cuvées. And they have it bedded in, and I tasted them, you know. I like history an awful lot, but I'm not a big fan of the orange wine because white Jews should be removed from the white skin, in my own opinion. But other people tend to like that. And I accept everybody's opinion because I always felt that there's a wine for every purpose. I'm drinking a rosé while we're talking with you because you're such a special wine person in North America. I've opened a little bottle of bubbly to celebrate.
Cheers.
Yeah.
You're right on occasion.
South African, little South African.
Oh, nice. So tell us about some other chapters in the book, John. Like, what else are you exploring? There's just so many stories in this. It's so rich to unpack. What else surprised you? What was kind of the most surprising thing you learned?
Almost everything, Natalie. The most important thing that surprised me was there's no doubt in my mind through the University of Toronto and University of Pennsylvania being able to do a lot of spectrograph and a lot of actual archaeological scientific research and documentation of dating the great pits that they found and these first little communities. Remember, they were hunter-gatherers. We come out of the caves, we stop following, we build little wooden huts. We start growing stuff. So we planted grapevines. At the same time, we could plant maize and other things too. And now we had a better food supply, which means the population increase. It goes from a little cluster of huts into a small village. A village grows into a city. I was surprised to find out the first city was actually in Turkey, Katel Huyak. I found so many languages and so many words that you couldn't find. And it's amazing how some of them are transferable back to different languages. The Canaanites and the Hittites and the Babylonians all referred to this ancient city. And in that ancient city, they became prosperous. We're leaving the Stone Age now and going into the Bronze Age. They knew that the first few things they made with copper worked, even some of the copper containers that they began to ferment their wine with. But the minute they mixed it with tin, they could have bronze. So that was the advent of the Bronze Age. There was bronze I found in Cyprus. There was bronze that I found in England, surprisingly, which means these ancient people had to trade something to get the tin to mix with their copper to make bronze. These ancient civilizations talking about what they thought were ancient civilizations. But a simple answer to your question was, as I went through all this, I said, really, at the end of the last ice age, from 30,000 years ago to about 15,000, then it slowly warmed again. So we came out of the caves 10,000 years ago. And I said, 10,000 years ago seems so long, but I came to the conclusion that our whole time span, our connection back to the Roman Empire is just a nanosecond in the time of existence of mankind. And things keep changing so rapidly. My grandchildren, they just take all this high-tech stuff for granted.
Right.
Right. I was just talking to some students 2 years ago, and then none of them had ever seen a typewriter. College students. Now I'm talking about college students. And they said, no, we use a word processor on our computer. So I was thinking about all the things that changed so quickly. How did the Etruscans begin to get this? Why did the Greeks call Italy Enotekia, the land flooded with vines? Because the Persians had taken them there. So I've slowly become, in the last year, I said, like, my book, Wine for Intellectuals, gives you the fundamentals, basic things that you really want to know, and hopefully to open your mind up. And so wine, the source of civilization, is supposed to start some conversation around a dinner table, conversation at a dinner party. If you get some people together on a Saturday afternoon, I know everybody that watches your show always does little wine gatherings.
Yeah.
You call everybody and you say, okay, everybody bring a Pinot Noir. It can be from East Coast, West Coast, or Europe. Everybody bring a Merlot, European or North American, and we'll do a little comparison, a little contrast. They're the ways to learn things. And I said, I wanted this book to have enough information so people can say, if wine was really this old, or this grape came from someplace else, I just have so much that I want to learn. I got fascinated in the classroom teaching Shakespeare.
Yeah. I know that's part of your background. And how did you segue over from Shakespeare to wine? Were you just a wine lover?
No. I drank simple, basic wine. I was a young guy in construction. I drank beer like most young 18, 20-year-olds did. And then the more students I had and the more lecturing I did on it, every time I would come across a character, Sir John Falstaff, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, it's sack tonight. Sack tonight we'll have. You get 20 students in hand, 20 hands go up. What's sack? Okay, sack is a nickname for sherry. Why do they call it sherry? Okay. And I had to start looking a lot of this information up because I wasn't educated that we in North America tends to name wines after the grapes, whereas Europe named them from the location. Something as simple as that.
Right.
And I would come back and say, don't be confused. If it says Bordeaux, it comes from Bordeaux. You don't have to know it's Cab Franc, Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon. And there's actually 6 of them, right? But 5 are the ones they know.
Sure.
And that little information is important, but it's not what makes you fall in love with wine. It's the people that drink wine. So the object of wine, the source of civilization, is people from all different fields, truck drivers and brain surgeons, to kind of read through it and say, where do I fit into this enormous time span that John Mahoney says is just a nanosecond, right? Which makes our lives even so much shorter. So we say, don't waste a single minute.
I love that. Carpe diem or grab the bottle, not just the day, but the bottle.
Exactly.
What is your favorite wine pairing with that bubbly you're drinking, John?
This is Samansig from Stellenbosch.
Right, in South
right?
Africa, yeah.
South Africa, yes. I tend to start every meal with bubbles. I joke with my wife, and I told you prior to the show, we were just casually talking about an anniversary coming up. I live relatively moderately. I never made a lot of money, and it was nice until my wife said, I don't care for sparkling wine. Then one day she drank some French champagne and she said, this is really nice. And now for the last 20 years, my whole economic situation has been depleted because my wife fell in love with sparkling wines, especially champagne.
Right, but you're
You know?
still going to hold on to her because it's been 50 years, I hear.
Yes, yes. This coming this
Congratulations.
week. Yeah. We were married in 1968, and we started on our 10th anniversary of looking. And I started wine very early, and I was able to put them away. So,
Good for you.
calling myself a wine missionary and trying to not sell wine, but to have people enjoy wine because it's tied in with music, art, literature. It's a liquid that makes people be gregarious, and that's what you want to do. I was fortunate enough to
Absolutely.
grab a bunch of wines then. So, as I said to you earlier, every year on our anniversary for the last 35 years, I've opened a bottle of wine from the year we were married. And
Oh,
ironically, whatever restaurant we're in, New Jersey has a lot of BYOBs,
okay.
right?
That's good. Yep. Bring your own
Yeah,
bottle. Yep.
bring your own bottle. And even when I've gone to places that don't, I say, this is an anniversary wine. They'll ignore or reduce your corkage fee because of custom. I mean, they'd be foolish not to, right?
Yeah.
And inevitably, there's always somebody else in the restaurant. I'll send the wait staff around and say, ask if anybody else was married in 1968. Half the time, we found people that were born in 1968. So I set a glass over and we share something from their birth year. And
That's
that's what you're
great.
supposed to do, you know?
Absolutely. That is
Mhm.
bringing people together, that commensality, bringing people together through food and wine. What variety was identified first for wine?
In the second chapter of this book, I go all the way back. Probably the most prominent writer was Columella. He was one of the Roman writers, or four famous writers that were agricultural writers. Columella was so good about what type of grapes should go in what soil, which one they would let grow up a tree, which one had to be on a stake. That his stuff came from BC area, and his writings were used all the way through the middle, matter of fact, into the end of the Middle Ages. All his instructions on wine growing.
Okay.
So the chapter starts in here when they first found the grapevines before they had developed Vintus vinifera. That's the one. Vintus is the genus, right? Vintus vinifera is the Chardonnay, Cabernet, Cab Franc. That's the species that we tend to like. And Canada and the United States, even some parts of Mexico, have indigenous grapes. Our southern states have a Vintus rotunda. We have a Riparia, which means along the riverbanks. There's a whole series of different names. Labrusca is the wild tree growing one. That's
Hmm.
like Concord, Niagara. They're okay for making wine, but they're much better for making jam.
Huh.
Whenever I drink a Concord wine, I want a peanut butter sandwich. I just, you know,
Yep.
because of Welch's grape jam, right?
Yes.
Which started a quarter mile from where I'm living. The city of Vineland, New Jersey is where Welch's grape actually first began before they moved upstate New York by the Finger Lakes.
Oh, wow.
So, in essence, I explain how they began to stumble on. There's two different species, and what they found was they're like holly trees. They have to have a male and a female plant. Without getting too scientific into the whole thing, our early ancestors were able to cross and blend a lot of these to develop Vinus vinifera. So some of them had certain names that you could trace back. Like there's a grape that came from Lebanon,
Okay.
right? That probably came from southern Anatolia 6,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, because that's where the Phoenicians were. There was a
Okay.
grape they think ended up in Switzerland and is today the modern Fredant grape.
Oh, okay.
Making that one. And also you can probably trace Trebbiano back to that too from Italy. So tracing them back goes to the area, but it also mentions that the Egyptians mentioned vintage years. You know, in King Tut's tomb, they found containers, amphora labeled year 4, 5, and 9.
Huh.
So they're not sure if it had to do, probably the vintages were according to each pharaoh. So they would
Right.
change constantly. And if you start getting in wine, you start looking into the Egyptian writings. They provided more information than literally anybody about growing, planting, storing. They were the first ones, because it was the Romans that learned from the Egyptians that wines age and they mellow out and they get softer and more palatable.
Oh,
I had
wow.
never known that before I had done this research. I know I like older wines.
Yes.
Right? As I get older, you know, I think we
Everything
both,
mellows.
everything mellows. Yes.
Speaking of that, John, what is the oldest wine you've had, or one of the older wines that you have lately?
This is a 1937
Oh,
Chateau Aubryon,
wow.
because a friend of mine was born in 37. I could never afford it nowadays. I was able to have it. But if you like Pinot Noir, 1949 was a spectacular year of French Burgundy. We had this as an Hospice de Bon from the hospital, and it's Nicolas Lalande. So this was purchased at their
Their
annual
auction.
auction, yes,
Yes.
on
Oh,
there. And
fantastic.
this is Pinot Noir that everybody's trying to imitate.
Huh.
This is bottle number 81. I was surprised to
Oh
find.
my
So
goodness. And this is just a segue that is natural. You have a special gadget to open old bottles that might have a dried cork, right?
uh, wine has so many gadgets, and I always tell
Mm.
people invest in bottles, right? Invest in bottles, not devices. But because I have so many old ones, my wife for my birthday last year got me this Duran corkscrew. It was worth every penny because I do when I open old bottles, the cork split. None of the average corkscrews are long enough to go through old Barolo or Barbaresco or Bordeaux corks. And this
Okay.
one separates and you screw in like it would be a regular helix from a regular corkscrew,
Okay.
right? But there's no flange or handle to pull it out. Then you put the Asu perpendicular to it because it can't push the cork down.
Right.
Any amateur can slide this down, no trouble at all, even if the cork is 50 or 60 years old. I opened a Chateau
Ah.
Talbot about 5 months ago from 1900. And
Wow.
when we pulled the cork up, as soon as we slid the Asu off, it was still on this, and we started to slide it off, and it just crumbled into 10,000 pieces
Oof.
in our hand that we had.
Yeah.
But this little device I found because if you're going to have older ones, and even if you like young fruity wines right now,
Hmm.
lay some wine down from the year you were married or from the date of your first children's birthdays and things like this.
Right. Yeah,
You
absolutely.
know,
See how they taste
yeah.
later.
And I
Yeah.
always tell people, you don't need a cold, wet, dark cellar. And where I live in New Jersey, we're always highly humidified, and most of us have cellars because we're in far enough from the coast. I built racks along my northern wall because that was the
Okay.
one that cooled off the slowest in the summertime. I've
Yeah.
had some friends that built them. I said, no, you should have built it on the other side of your basement because that side is surprisingly a little cooler. Put your oldest wines on the floor and your younger ones a little higher because there's a difference of 7 to 10 degrees between the floor of your basement and the ceiling of the basement,
Wow.
and leave them in the dark, laying on their side. And 10 years go by so quickly. And all of a sudden, somebody's coming over and you say, hey, let's have this 10-year-old Pinot Noir or this Barola. And I had to learn that from some older people, you know,
And now you're passing it along.
passing it
That's
on. Yes.
great advice. What advice would you give to your 30-year-old self, especially when it comes to wine?
As I said, first of all, flashing back at that time, the first thing I would do is buy 2 bottles of each wine because I really like it. I don't have to run back to the wine shop for another one.
Yeah.
And if I find it that somebody says, gee, it's a little dry or I'm not quite used to it, it gives me an opportunity to lay it down. Young people
Yes.
tend not to want to store and age wines. In my first book, I always say, you only need 18 bottles of wine to be called a wine collector. 1,000 or 2,000 or 5,000, right?
Yeah.
And I started a long time ago. So as I said earlier, I'm in the process of drinking my wine cellar. So when I go out with people or when we get together for things, one of your friends just said they're doing a Pinot Noir study tonight. And so I'd be able to get a 20-year-old Pinot Noir, whether you're French Burgundy or even a California one, and say, what happens to them when they change? So
Mm.
that's the first thing. The second bit of information, and it took me a long time to learn this, was never just drink one glass of wine. I tend not to finish a bottle at night, and I always have a third of it left over. I pump the air off, and the next night that goes in glass number 1, and my
Huh.
new bottle goes in glass number 2. So my
Interesting.
wife and I having dinner, or if my children are down from New York, or friends are over, everybody has 2 glasses in front of them to compare.
Ah.
Right. And it's not a 2015 Bordeaux versus a 2010 Bordeaux. It could be a Bordeaux versus a California Cab, or it could be an Italian Chianti versus a Merlot from Long Island. Just so they're different, because so many people are intimidated when somebody says, oh, I smell like this is a rosé. And I always get a little bit of wild, unripe strawberry from the Grenache that's in this particular grape. And
Yes.
they say, how do you get that? Where does that come from? I said, well, Europeans grew up smelling things, smelling the spice drawer. Their parents are always saying this. We don't do that. So we have to concentrate on it. But if you do it with a group, all of a sudden people start saying, oh, I smell that.
Hmm.
I can pick. And it just changes your whole life.
It
So I always
does.
say, drink 2 wines together.
Yes.
Another,
Absolutely. I like that theory.
and one other little trick I like
Yeah.
to, while we're talking to people, is
Absolutely.
pour a glass before everyone gets there,
Yeah.
or even when they're there, and then take the same bottle and put it in the refrigerator for a while, or
Hmm.
even in the freezer, and drink the same wine, one at room temperature and one cold,
Right.
especially if they're novices, because too many people in the Western Hemisphere, the British had tea and promoted tea all around the world from China and India, but it was North America that made iced tea.
Wow.
right? So we grow up drinking over cold iced tea, soft drinks. We're ice oriented. So when you try to get new young wine drinkers to drink a Merlot or a Cab at room temperature, they say, "Oh, I like my stuff cold," right? So if they drink that Pinot Noir room temperature and it's soft in their mouth, and then they drink the cold one without going into the long molecular weights of tannic acids, or as you lower temperature, the only acid that's highlighted and enhanced is tannic acid. A cold red wine dries and makes your mouth bitter, whereas
Huh.
a room temperature one is permitting the tannic acid to intermingle with the tartaric and citric acid, all 35 acids. So they say, "Oh, I really like this. It's not as cold as I thought, but it's not puckering back in my mouth." You
Oh,
know?
wow. Fascinating.
Yeah,
Fascinating.
and that's a great
Science.
little trick I say for young people. Say, try a cold one and a warm one, and you can learn so much faster.
Absolutely. That is fantastic. Wow. Not just history, science as
A
well.
little bit of science, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's what happened. As I said, I had students, they asked me, what was Sir John Falstaff drinking before when I mentioned sack or that? And so many quotes. Hemingway. I remember in a class one time, I was actually covering for another teacher, and they were doing Edgar Allan Poe's Cask of Amontillado.
Oh,
Student
yes.
came up and says, "What's this? Amontillado." I said, "Well, it's Spanish, and it's a ya with a double L, and it's pronounced Amontillado." "What is that?"
Yes.
I said, "That's a sherry." "Okay,
Right.
what's a sherry?" I said, "This is a drink. This comes from Spain." And I got into fortification. And all of a sudden, the bell rang, and I realized, we talked a little bit about Poe's story of revenge, right? That's a great story because the idea is to be able to do something and to be able to get away with it. That's the story, right? Which he does. He bricks his victim in the wall.
Yes.
Um,
But
right.
lured down to the cellar with the sherry.
Yeah, yeah.
I
And
love
that's the
that.
way I was always taught. And I was a visiting teacher for my friend. I said, "But if you guys want another point of view on their story, how does the story end?" And one young lady said, he's in the confessional. 100 years later, he got away with the whole thing. I said, "No, he didn't. Poe was telling you how he murdered this guy, and now he's in the confessional because he's been tormented all his life." And then one kid burst out, "I got to read the story. We're supposed to have read it already." So
That's
it's another way
great.
of looking at things.
Absolutely. I love that.
Yeah.
Guys, it's fantastic, isn't it? The advice just goes on. It's not just limited to your book. You know so much, including the weather for 1900 versus
Well,
1899.
that's ironically what happens is when you start learning about different wines and you start to build a little cellar, you actually start checking, why was 1945 so great? The vineyards were devastated. World War II was over. And you find that, 45 was kind of like Dionysius rewarding the people for finally finding peace. And again, it was perfect sunshine, the perfect amount of rain. So 1945 Bordeaux's were, I think, still considered, 29s and 45 still considered some of the greatest wines ever produced.
Wow, that is fantastic. Oh, John, there's a few questions I want to ask you as we're running out of time, but if you could share a bottle of wine with anyone, living or dead, who would it be and why?
I'd like to share a bottle of wine with Louis Pasteur. North America destroyed our phylloxera house. As long as we had sailing ships very quickly, the phylloxera died. But as soon as we got steamships and we could get from North America back to Europe quickly, the little bug that destroys the vines had a chance to live, spread around Europe, destroyed things. And Louis Pasteur really was the one who did all the research on this.
Huh, I
So if I
didn't
couldn't
realize
get,
that.
if I couldn't get Thomas Jefferson,
If he was busy.
yeah, or if I couldn't get Thomas Jefferson, who was the third American president and a great wine advocate. In the States, Thomas Jefferson, nothing else had happened until Ronald Reagan came along. And whether you like this politics or not, what he really did as an American president was he changed the wine cellar in the White House. Before that, it was all French.
Huh,
And after Ronald Reagan came in, he made wines mostly from California, but also North American wines. So I know
right.
he had some ice wine from Vinland Vineyards near Toronto. And the White House has a whole selection of wines from northern Mexico and Baja, but mostly the United States and all of Canada.
Well, didn't Jefferson say no nation is drunken where wine is cheap
Where
or
wine is cheap.
affordable? Something
Yes,
like that.
that
Yeah,
is right. Where wine
I
is
knew
cheap.
it. Because wine is the slow relaxation versus your rum and your vodka
Right.
and everything else.
Yeah, and I don't knock people about to drink hard spirits. I always try to tell them I grew up in an age when everybody was instructed to have a martini or a Manhattan prior to dinner, and I always said Europeans drink their hard alcohol after the meal. The grappas, the
Right.
Mars, the brandies, the
You're
cognacs.
right.
Right?
You're right.
I said we're the only place. Canada and the United States was the only place in the entire world that
Hmm.
drank hard alcohol prior to that. So I always say start with a sparkling wine It's only
Yeah.
12% alcohol. And that'll refresh your palate and get the whole thing in. I cover a lot of interesting stories in this Wine, the Source of Civilization, because it's supposed to create a conversation.
Yes.
That's what I really want.
So
But
getting that. John, this has been quite the conversation. So as we wrap up, tell us where we can get your book. Can we get it online?
yes, that's the easiest way. Barnes and Nobles and bookstores sometimes have to reorder them. But one of my earlier books is still available called Every Bottle Has a Story, Natalie.
Oh,
And
neat.
these are little short stories
Yeah.
written in the style of different authors.
Okay.
And it took me 9 years to write this, as small as it is. And this is $9.99. I won't let my paperbacks go over $14.99. And any money that I make from writing, because I'm retired from another profession, all goes into scholarship money.
Oh,
Every cent
wow.
I've made from as
Wow.
an author all goes into scholarship money, hoping to help future people enjoy their lives a little bit better through education. Amazon.com is the quickest, easiest way to
Yep.
do it.
Yep.
That's the simplest thing.
Okay, awesome. Amazon.ca in Canada or Indigo Chapters, I'm sure, has
Yeah.
it. That's another chain for us up here.
And I have a little site called JohnMahoneyDrinksWine.com where
Okay.
because I'm older and I'm drinking my cellar now, they're not all old wines. I tend to review a wine. I'm one of the few reviewers that always mentions the percent of alcohol.
Yes, I agree. That's important.
I think so. But remember when Zinfandels are all 13.5%, and now the ones from Lodi are 16,
I know.
17%.
I
And they're
mean,
using
port's 19. We're creeping up there.
exactly the same thing. They're using hybrid yeast to get that. So wine is food. It's a liquid part of the meal. That's how I start all my talks. I quote Benjamin Franklin, who said, after the fifth forkful, your mouth gets dull. Wine is supposed to refresh your palate and make forkful number 6 taste just as great as that first forkful was. So
Wow.
that's why I drink wine every night, every single night.
Oh,
But
I'll have to read
John,
more about him for sure.
yeah, and then at JohnMahoneyDrinksWine.com, it just
Yeah.
flashes on. I tend to show you the bottle. My photography isn't always as good as your work, but the label, the bottle, and I give you information on it, a number of points. But
Awesome.
we all are now have joined the aspect of being wine missionaries to share
Mhm.
all this information we learn with our friends. Have another wine
Absolutely.
party.
Amen to that.
Okay. Thank you
John,
so
it's
much.
been such a delight. Thank you so much. Great stories and wish you all the best with all of your books and would love to chat with you again.
I hope so. I hope we can get together sometime. Yeah.
All right. Take care, John.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye, Natalie.
Okay. Cheers. That was terrific. Here are my takeaways from this discussion. Number 1, I admire John's deep curiosity about wine and how it was his students' questions that became the basis for his latest book. He's so adept at taking their questions, such as Sir John Falstaff's sack or sherry, and weaving it into the context of the humanities. I've always believed that you could do a liberal arts degree with wine as the central hub or organizing principle, as it connects to literature, art, history, geography, commerce, and so many other fields. 2, it surprised me that wine is much older than we thought, as old as 8,000 years or just after the last ice age. But that makes sense given that grape juice is prone to spontaneous fermentation with wild yeast in the air. 3, I loved his story about noticing small things like the direction in which the vines curve or curl around the trellis, the way fluids circle down the drain depending on your hemisphere. 4, I also loved John's point that the Romans, who were famous for making wine and introducing it to other nations that they conquered, actually learned about aging wine from the Egyptians. This reminds me of that sacred geometry and the pyramids that we discussed with vegan winemaker Ezra Sipes from BC on episode 9. Check that out if you missed it. 5, John gives us some of the best practical tips ever for appreciating wine. Try 2 glasses of the same wine side by side, one at room temperature and the other fridge cold. It makes a world of difference in terms of the aromas and flavors you'll perceive, as well as other aspects from tannin to alcohol. Do try this at home. And 6, did you know that you can now listen to this podcast on your smart speaker? Just say, "Hey Google," or "Alexa, play the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast." I'd love to chat about wine with you while you're doing the dishes, the laundry, having breakfast, lunch, or dinner. It's always wine time. You'll find links to the wines we discuss, John's books, his social media links and website, as well as the gadgets he mentions, and a link to the video edition of this chat so that you can see the Durant corkscrew in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/21. So, what was your favorite tip or quote from this episode? Please share that with me on Twitter or Facebook and tag me at Natalie MacLean. On Instagram, I'm at Natalie MacLean Wine, or use the hashtag #UnreservedWineTalk. If you liked this episode, please tell one friend about it. My podcast is really easy to find, whether you search on its name, Unreserved Wine Talk, or on my name. Finally, if you want to take your ability to pair wine and food to the next level, join me in a free online video class at nataliemaclean.com/class. My next guest on the show will be California winemaker Randall Graham of Bonnie Doon Winery, who blends wit and wisdom unlike any other person in the wine world. You won't want to miss it. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.